At 68 years old, Evelyn Harper stood alone in the middle of a screaming Montana blizzard, her small wooden house nearly invisible beneath walls of drifting snow. Yet inside, not a single draft touched her skin, not a single flame flickered out, and while the rest of Boone County fought to survive the cold, she sat in quiet, steady warmth behind a barrier everyone had once laughed at, because months earlier, when the skies were still clear and the ground still forgiving, Evelyn had begun doing something no one could understand, something that turned heads, sparked rumors, and made even her closest neighbors shake theirs in disbelief. She started mortaring rough fieldstone around her aging wooden home, one heavy, uneven rock at a time, hauling them from the edges of her land in a rusted wheelbarrow, mixing her own mortar in a dented steel trough, and building a second wall that pressed tight against the first, sealing her house inside a growing shell of stone that made it look less like a home and more like something buried, something stubborn, something that didn't belong in the neat, open plains of Montana where homes were built light, practical, and replaceable. People noticed. Of course they did, because in a place like Boone County, where routines rarely changed and everyone understood the rhythm of the seasons, anything unusual stood out like a storm on the horizon, and Evelyn's work was more than unusual. It was unsettling, especially because she never explained it, never offered a reason, never responded to the quiet jokes that followed her into the general store or the sideways glances at the gas pump, where men who had built their own barns and repaired their own roofs leaned casually against pickup trucks and tried to make sense of what she was doing. "She's sealing herself in," one of them said with a chuckle that didn't quite hide his unease. "Like she's expecting the end of the world," another replied, while inside, near the counter, a woman who had known Evelyn for decades simply shook her head and muttered, "She's always been a little different." But different wasn't the word Evelyn would have used, because to her, what she was doing wasn't strange at all. It was necessary. It was remembered. It was the kind of work that didn't come from imagination but from experience, from a winter long ago that most people have forgotten or softened in their minds. A winter that had taught her something permanent about cold, about wind, about how quickly comfort could disappear when the weather stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. She didn't talk about that winter, not anymore, not after so many years had passed and so many people had moved on, but it lived in the way she worked now, in the careful thickness of each stone layer, in the way she packed earth along the base of the walls to block the wind from creeping underneath, in the way she measured every seam and gap with her bare hands, feeling for the places where air could slip through and steal heat when it mattered most. Her house had been standing for over 40 years, built by her husband back when they were young and strong and certain that hard work alone could outlast anything. A simple wooden structure with wide windows, thin walls, and a furnace that had always been good enough. But time had a way of changing what good enough meant, and after her husband passed, and the winters seemed to grow sharper, less predictable, Evelyn began to notice things others ignored. The way the wind cut through the siding during storms, the way the heat never quite stayed where it should, the way the house felt like it was always negotiating with the cold instead of standing against it. And that quiet realization settled into something firm, something that didn't leave her alone, until one morning she woke up, walked outside, and started pulling stones from the edge of her property without telling a single person why. Day after day, she worked without pause, her movements steady, deliberate, never rushed, even. As the summer sun beat down and the autumn winds began to return, her hands grew rough, her shoulders ached, but the wall rose higher, thicker, stronger, wrapping around her home like a second skin, transforming it slowly into something heavier, something grounded, something that didn't fight the environment but absorbed it. And by the time the first frost touched the fields, her house looked different enough that even passing drivers slowed down to stare, because it no longer resembled the other homes scattered across the land. It looked older than it was, almost ancient, as if it had been there long before the town itself, and that made people uneasy in a way they couldn't quite explain, because it suggested something they didn't want to consider. That maybe Evelyn saw something coming that they didn't, that maybe her silence wasn't stubbornness but certainty, and still, no one asked her directly. No one stepped close enough to hear the quiet logic behind her work, because it was easier to laugh, easier to dismiss, Easier to believe that the winters would come and go the way they always had, predictable, survivable, familiar. And so they prepared the way they always did, stacking firewood in loose piles, checking their furnaces once or twice, trusting the systems they'd trusted for years, while Evelyn finished sealing her final layer of stone, pressing mortar into the last open seam just as the sky began to change, just as the air sharpened in that subtle, almost imperceptible way that most people ignored, but that she recognized instantly, because she had felt it before, decades ago, right before everything shifted. And as she stepped back to look at her work, at the thick, unbroken wall of fieldstone surrounding her wooden home, at the reinforced shutters she had installed over each window, at the carefully sealed door that now closed with a heavy, airtight certainty, she didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded once, quietly, as if confirming something only she understood, because she knew the truth that no one else in Boone County was ready to accept yet. This winter wasn't going to be like the others, and when it finally arrived, it wouldn't test comfort. It would test survival. The first warning didn't come as a blizzard, but as a silence so complete it felt unnatural, the kind that settled over Boone County like a held breath, pressing down on the land before anyone realized what it meant, because the forecast had sounded routine at first. Another cold front, another winter system moving in from the north, the kind of thing people had lived through their entire lives. But Evelyn Harper heard something different in the tone of those warnings, something buried beneath. The calm delivery of expected snowfall and dropping temperatures. And 3 days before the storm even touched the horizon, she had already closed herself inside her stone-wrapped home, doubling her firewood reserves, checking every seam in her mortar, running her hands slowly along the interior walls as if listening through her fingertips for weakness, while across the county, life continued almost unchanged. Neighbors making the usual preparations without urgency, stacking wood loosely, topping off propane tanks, trusting the same furnaces that had always been enough, because that was the rhythm they knew and no one wanted to believe it might fail them. Not this time. Not in a place where winter had always been harsh but manageable. But by the second day, the air shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. The temperature dropped faster than expected, not gradually, but sharply. And the wind arrived not in gusts, but in a steady, relentless force that seemed to move through everything instead of around it, pushing against houses, slipping into cracks, testing every structure like it had intention behind it. And when the snow finally began, it didn't fall gently. It drove sideways, dense and blinding, piling against walls faster than people could clear it, turning open land into a white void where distance and direction became meaningless. And inside their homes, families began to notice the difference. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, like a realization creeping in from the edges. The heat didn't feel as steady. The rooms near the walls felt colder than they should. Windows iced over from the inside, forming thick, opaque layers that blocked out what little light remained, and furnaces that had always cycled on and off with quiet reliability now ran constantly, pushing harder against a cold that seemed to press inward with equal force. And still, most people told themselves it would pass, that it always did, that this was just another storm stretching a little longer than usual, until the power flickered, once, then again, and then disappeared entirely across large sections of the county, leaving homes suddenly dependent on backup systems that weren't designed for this kind of sustained assault. Generators sputtered under the strain, some failing within hours as fuel thickened in the extreme cold, diesel engines refusing to turn over, gas lines freezing where they weren't insulated well enough, and the temperature kept dropping, not stabilizing the way it should after a storm settled in, but falling deeper, sharper, until stepping outside even for a moment felt like stepping into something alive. Something that bit at exposed skin and burned the lungs with every breath. And inside the Callahan family's ranch house, 2 miles from Evelyn's property, the change became impossible to ignore when the thermostat read numbers they had never seen indoors before, the furnace running non-stop, yet losing ground. Their breath beginning to show faintly in the air. "It's just the wind," Mr. Callahan said at first, adjusting the settings even though he knew it wouldn't change anything. But by the second night, the truth settled in as frost began creeping along the interior walls, thin white veins spreading across the wood like cracks. their pipes groaning under the pressure of freezing water. The generator outside coughing and struggling before finally falling silent, and the house that had always felt solid and dependable began to feel fragile, temporary, like it was only holding together out of habit, rather than strength. And it wasn't just them. All across Boone County, similar scenes were unfolding. Families layering blankets over doors, lighting fireplaces that couldn't keep up, retreating into smaller rooms to conserve heat, watching as their homes slowly surrendered to a cold that didn't behave like anything they had experienced before. And somewhere in the middle of that second night, when the storm had reached its full force and the world outside had disappeared into a blur of white and darkness, Mr. Callahan stood at the window, wiping away a thin layer of frost just enough to see through. And that's when he noticed it. Not movement, not light exactly, but the absence of struggle. Far out across the buried fields where Evelyn Harper's house stood alone, there was no flickering, no dimming, no sign of failure, just a stillness that felt deliberate, as if her home existed outside the storm's reach. And even more unsettling, the snow didn't seem to pile against it the same way it did against every other structure, the wind bending slightly as it passed, sliding along the curved edges of stone instead of slamming into flat wooden walls. And for a long moment, he just stared, trying to understand what he was seeing, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew about winter, about homes, about survival. And behind him, his wife's voice broke the silence, quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "How is hers still holding?" she asked, and he didn't answer right away, because the truth was already forming in his mind, heavy and unavoidable, tied to months of quiet observation and dismissed concern, tied to the image of an older woman hauling stone under a summer sun while everyone else shook their heads and laughed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, something that hadn't been there before. Not doubt, not confusion, but realization. "Because she knew," he said, barely above a whisper, and outside, the storm didn't weaken, didn't ease, didn't give them time to adjust. It tightened, pressing harder, colder, more relentless with every passing hour, turning what had once been routine preparation into a test no one in Boone County had truly prepared for. No one except the one person they had all underestimated. The one person now sitting inside a house wrapped in stone, where the heat didn't escape and the cold couldn't enter. Waiting not in fear, but in certainty, as the rest of the county slowly came to understand the difference between enduring a winter and surviving one. By the fourth night, the storm had stripped Boone County down to something raw and unforgiving, where pride no longer mattered and survival became the only language anyone understood. And inside the Callahan home, where the temperature had fallen so low that even layered blankets couldn't trap enough warmth, the decision finally came not as a discussion but as a quiet, shared understanding that staying meant risking everything. So they bundled themselves in whatever they could find, coats over coats, scarves wrapped tight across their faces, gloves doubled until fingers could barely move, and stepped outside into a world that no longer felt like the one they knew. The wind hitting them with such force it stole their breath instantly, the cold biting through every layer as if searching for skin. And for a moment, just a moment, hesitation crept in because the distance to Evelyn Harper's house suddenly felt impossible. But turning back meant facing a slower, colder end. So they moved forward, one step at a time, leaning into the wind, navigating by memory more than sight as the snow erased the path beneath their feet almost as quickly as they made it. The journey stretching far longer than it should have, each minute dragging into the next as exhaustion and cold tried to pull them down, until finally, through the blur of white and darkness, a shape began to form ahead of them, low, solid, half buried in snow but unmistakably intact. And as they drew closer, the difference became undeniable, because where their own home had groaned and resisted the storm, this one seemed to absorb it. The thick fieldstone walls layered with frost but unshaken, the wind sliding past instead of crashing against it, the drifts curving along its sides instead of piling up in suffocating heaps. And when they reached the door, it didn't rattle or strain under the pressure outside. It stood firm, sealed, waiting, and Mr. Callahan raised his hand and knocked, once, then again, harder. This time, the sound dull against the reinforced surface, and for a long second, Nothing happened, the storm howling around them as if trying to drown out any chance of being heard. Until suddenly, there was a shift from within, a solid, deliberate click, and the door opened inward, not forced by wind but controlled from inside. And with it came a wave of warmth so steady and complete it felt unreal, like stepping into a different world. And Evelyn Harper stood there, framed by soft, steady light. Her expression calm, unsurprised, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside without hesitation. And as they crossed the threshold, the change was immediate and overwhelming. The cold that had clung to them vanishing almost instantly, replaced by a deep, even warmth that didn't flicker or fade. The air still and controlled, untouched by drafts. And they stood there for a moment, unable to speak, unable to process how such a small house could feel so stable when everything else was failing, until Evelyn closed the door behind them with a firm, airtight seal that cut off the storm completely, reducing it to nothing more than a distant, muted force outside walls that did not yield. And as they removed their frozen layers, she moved quietly through the space, adjusting the small wood stove at the center of the room, its fire low but constant, radiating heat that seemed to linger, held and reflected by the thick stone surrounding them. "Stone keeps it in," she said after a moment, her voice steady, not defensive, not proud, just factual. "Wood lets it out," and there was no lecture in her tone, no trace of "I told you so." Only a quiet explanation of something she had understood long before anyone else thought to question it. And by the next morning, word had begun to spread in the only way it could under those conditions, through movement, through necessity, through the slow arrival of others who had reached the same breaking point, figures emerging from the storm one by one, drawn not by hope alone but by the visible proof that Evelyn's house was still standing, still functioning, still warm. And each time there was a knock, she answered it the same way, opening the door, stepping aside, letting them in without hesitation, without judgment. And inside, space was made where there seemed to be none. Supplies were rationed carefully. The fire was maintained with quiet precision, and the house held, not just structurally, but thermally, the thick fieldstone walls absorbing the heat from the stove and releasing it slowly, evenly, creating a stability that no furnace could replicate once power was gone. And outside, the storm continued its relentless assault for 2 more days, pushing temperatures to extremes that cracked pipes, warped wood, and left entire sections of the county silent and frozen, until finally, as suddenly as it had begun, it loosened its grip, the wind easing, the snowfall slowing, the sky clearing just enough for emergency crews to begin moving through what remained. And what they found was a landscape marked by failure. Homes damaged, systems collapsed, people shaken and exhausted. But when they reached Evelyn Harper's property, they stopped, because there, half buried yet completely intact, stood a house that had not just endured the storm but resisted it entirely, its walls solid, its interior warm, its occupants safe. And in the days that followed, as the county began the slow process of recovery, something shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet way people think differently after seeing something they can't ignore. Because now when they looked at Evelyn's house, they didn't see something strange or unnecessary. They saw something proven, something that had worked when everything else hadn't. And by spring, changes began to appear across Boone County. Stone reinforcements added to old homes, wind barriers built with more thought, insulation reconsidered not as convenience, but as survival. And Evelyn returned to her routine just as quietly as she had always lived, tending her land, repairing what little needed fixing, never seeking recognition, never explaining more than she had to, because for her, the lesson had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about remembering what the world was capable of and preparing accordingly. And now, as people passed her home, they no longer laughed or whispered. They simply looked, understanding at last that what had once seemed like stubborn isolation had, in truth, been something far more valuable. Experience, translated into action, and built, one stone at a time, into the difference between loss and survival.